Hello. So in this video, I'm going to give you another teaching strategy. And this is actually sort of two teaching strategies, but they're interconnected, or one of them is a version of the other one, I guess is the most accurate way of saying it. So I'm going to give you two strategies for having your students break down an article that they've read for homework. And these are two things that I've recently done. They worked pretty well. The first technique is a very simple one. You're going to ask your students to identify three things in a particular homework reading. So first is, what's the main argument that this author is making? What's their thesis? And what I tell my students, sometimes this will be easier than others, I tell them to try and find a single sentence or maybe a couple of sentences that give that key argument. But if they can't find something in the text itself, they can write their own version of the main argument. But you want them to figure out what's the central claim that this argument is making. Then you're going to ask them to think about what are the strengths of this article. What has it done well and why? Why are those things successful? Then you're going to have them think about what doesn't work here. What could be improved and why isn't it effective? So that's a very basic way of breaking down an article, but it's a very efficient way of doing it. And I like to use this technique early in the semester because then you can later develop more complicated versions of this where you ask your students to identify increasing numbers of different variables. But this very simple three-part structure is something that they can often do fairly quickly, especially with short articles. But the other big benefit of it is because you're asking them to think about what works and what doesn't work, you should make this explicit to them. But this is basically identifying things that they can do, things that they can use as models for their own writing, and things that they want to avoid. So this is part of reading critically, is always thinking about what can I steal from this to make my own writing work better, and what do I want to avoid? What has this author done that I don't think is effective that I want to make sure I'm not doing in my own writing? And so by having these be two of the three things that they're looking at in this activity, you can make it very, very easy for them to develop lists of things that they would want to use and things that they would want to avoid. Now, the second technique for breaking down an article to really sort of get to grips with it has a couple of more steps in it. So once again, I would start by having them identify the main argument. Again, whether that means finding a thesis statement or giving their own summary of the central argument, whatever it is. Next, you would have them identify key supporting claims. So this works especially well if you've already talked through things like essay structure and talked about how you want to use multiple section or paragraph level claims to support the larger argument. Because, I mean, again, we talked about this in my video on thesis statements. The thesis statement should be supported by sub-claims, smaller claims, whether those are section or paragraph level claims. So this is what you want them identifying in this second step, is what are the shorter or lower scale arguments that build the major overall claim. Third, you're going to have them identify the evidence that this author offers to support the claims. And a lot of times authors will offer different types of evidence, so you want to get them thinking about multiple ways that evidence can be approached. So is this author using anecdotes? Are they using textual analysis? Are they pointing to statistics? Are they pointing to legal decisions? Whatever it is. Personal observations. You want your students to be thinking about different types of different types of evidence that this author might draw in. The fourth stage is going to be to ask them which points, which arguments, which claims they are persuaded by and why. So I do phrase this differently for this activity. In this case, it is what are you persuaded by as opposed to what works well. Because what are you persuaded by is a slightly, I think, more pointed question. Because what works well is very open. Like that's an ill-defined question, which there's a good reason to do that, because the answers to that can be any number of things that are not necessarily persuasive things. It can be something like, this is an analogy that I find really compelling. Whereas if it's what are you persuaded by, the question is always, are you convinced? What things have they convinced you of? Which is a much more narrow focus, but it's really, really important for rhetoric that we're thinking in terms of persuasion. Obviously, because rhetoric is the art of persuasion. So what has this author persuaded you of, and why? Why is it convincing? And then finally, the last point, or the last question, the counterpoint to that is, where has this author failed to persuade you, and why? What has this author not convinced you of, and why isn't it convincing? And there's a couple of interesting ways you can think about that question. One is, are there actual faults in the logic, the reasoning? Have they failed to provide enough evidence, etc., etc.? The other way that you can approach this, and this is an interesting potential activity on its own, is what would the author need to have done to persuade you of these points? So I think these are two really good ways of breaking down arguments, especially, again, for early in a semester when students are starting to learn the ropes with rhetoric. I think these are very, very good approaches because they're serviceable, they're fairly straightforward, and again, I think students can get a lot out of this in terms of what can I use for my own writing, what do I want to avoid, which is really, really useful whenever you're having your students read anything for a rhetoric and composition class.